Wir, die Stiftung Mercator, wurden 1996 von der Familie Schmidt gegründet und mit großen finanziellen Mitteln ausgestattet. Die Familie Schmidt hat über Generationen hinweg ihre unternehmerischen Aktivitäten, vor allem im Groß- und Einzelhandel, aus Duisburg im Ruhrgebiet heraus betrieben. Aus diesem Grund sind wir nach dem Duisburger Kartografen und Kosmographen Gerhard Mercator benannt. Deshalb befindet sich unser Sitz auch im Ruhrgebiet, in Essen. Auch wenn wir uns inzwischen international, in Europa und ganz Deutschland engagieren, dem Ruhrgebiet fühlen wir uns immer noch besonders verbunden. Das Fundament unserer Arbeit sind immer unsere Werte, die unser Leitbild beschreiben. Bildung und Chancengleichheit, sozialer Zusammenhalt, das geeinte Europa, Toleranz und Weltoffenheit, die Förderung von Wissenschaft und Forschung sowie der Schutz der natürlichen Lebensgrundlagen. Welches die drängendsten gesellschaftlichen Themen sind, die unser Engagement verdienen, muss immer wieder neu ausgehandelt werden. Wir schauen, wo es Lücken und Defizite gibt, in denen wir uns sinnvoll einbringen können. Die Welt und ihre Herausforderungen verändern sich und so müssen auch wir uns mit ihr verändern. Wir entwickeln eigene Projekte, Partnergesellschaften, fördern ProjektpartnerInnen und kooperieren dabei mit Institutionen im In- und Ausland. Seit unserer Gründung 1996 haben wir rund 1700 Projekte auf den Weg gebracht. Dafür konnten wir rund 800 Millionen Euro einsetzen. Geförderte, Kofinanzierende und unser Team von derzeit rund 100 Menschen sind PartnerInnen bei der Problemlösung. Wir wollen unsere Arbeit auf eine pragmatische, inspirierende und überparteiliche Weise angehen. Gemeinsam geteiltes Wissen ist für uns die Grundlage des Wandels in einer pluralen Gesellschaft zum Besseren. Heute arbeiten wir in 4 miteinander verbundenen Bereichen daran, gesellschaftlich nützliche Veränderungen mit herbeizuführen. Digitalisierte Gesellschaft, Klimaschutz, Europa in der Welt sowie Teilhabe und Zusammenhalt. Wir sind ein Ort der Pluralität, ein Ort unterschiedlichster Haltungen, Erfahrungen und Kompetenzen. Mit einem divers aufgestellten Team und somit unterschiedlichen Perspektiven auf unsere Themen gewinnt unsere Arbeit an Qualität und Glaubwürdigkeit. Uns gibt es seit einem Vierteljahrhundert. 25 Jahre, in denen sich die Welt grundlegend verändert hat. 25 Jahre, in denen wir uns immer wieder verändert haben.
Guten Abend, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Gäste, Freundinnen und Freunde der Stiftung Mercator. Mein Name ist Wolfgang Rohe, ich bin Vorsitzender der Geschäftsführung der Stiftung Mercator und ich darf Sie herzlich begrüßen zum Mercator Salon mit Jill Lepore. How open will the future remain? The use of algorithmic systems from a historical perspective. Der heutige Salon ist der dritte in einer Folge von 5 Salons, die wir aus Anlass des 25. Geburtstags der Stiftung veranstalten. In ihnen wollen wir vor allem unsere Themen am Ende in einem Festsalon am 27. Oktober auch ein wenig uns selbst ins Zentrum rücken. In der vergangenen Woche haben wir bereits mit dem Klimaforscher Mojib Latif über Klima-, Meeres- und Artenschutz und wie sie mit unserer Gesundheit zusammenhängen, diskutiert, sowie mit Francesca Bria, der Präsidentin des italienischen Nationalen Innovationsfonds, über Europas Souveränität im digitalen Zeitalter. Das Thema des heutigen Abends, Digitalisierung, künstliche Intelligenz, klingt oftmals abstrakt, manchmal unbehaglich und vielfach sogar abschreckend. Dabei beherrschen die vielfältigen Auswirkungen von Digitalisierung mehr und mehr unseren Alltag. Wir sollten diese Auswirkungen kennen. Wir sollten sie beurteilen können und begründete Meinungen uns darüber bilden, welchen Gebrauch von Digitalisierung wir machen wollen und welchen wir nicht machen wollen. Eine historische Sicht auf die Situation, in der wir heute stecken, kann uns dabei helfen. Fragen und Probleme besser zu benennen, Risiken nicht zu unterschätzen und Chancen besser zu nutzen. Lepore betreibt Geschichtswissenschaft immer mit diesem Ziel, unsere Gegenwart besser zu verstehen und zu bewältigen. Ich freue mich darum sehr auf Ihre Einsichten zum Thema und darf nun an Julika Griem und Luis Klamroth übergeben und mich bei dieser Gelegenheit schon auch bei Julika Griem sehr herzlich bedanken, dass sie sich an der Gestaltung des heutigen Abends beteiligt.
Good evening, everybody out there. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, Jill Lepore. It's a great pleasure to see you again in Essen, at least in this digital way. Thanks to Wolfgang Rohe for a very generous greeting tonight. I'm Julika Griem. I am a professor of English literature and cultural studies, and I am the director of the Essen-based Institute for Advanced Cultural Study, right next corner. And before I have the pleasure to introduce and welcome Jill Lepore as our distinguished guest tonight, I hand over to Luis Klamroth, who's going to prevent me from losing myself in ever more academic loops.
I am Luis. Hey, Jill Lepore, nice to meet you, digitally at least. And I'm here for you guys, for the viewers. If you have any questions, any statements throughout this evening, just put them down in the app and I'll ask them. Und Sie können die Fragen auch auf Deutsch stellen, dann übersetze ich die einfach, wenn Sie sich im Deutschen sicherer fühlen. Das ist überhaupt kein Problem. So ask away in Spanish, French, German or English. We'll manage to ask all the questions to Jill Lepore.
Thanks a lot, Luis. So, hello again, Jill. It's so wonderful to have you. To all of you, Jill Lepore is a professor of American history at Harvard University, and she is simply one of the most prolific American historians of our times. But she is also much more, as you will learn later on during this evening. Her recent book, These Truths, has been widely acclaimed internationally and also published in Germany under the title of Diese Wahrheiten with Beck in Munich. Her most recent book, If Then, will be one topic of our conversation tonight. But as I said, there's so much more to this professor. If I were to describe her very briefly, I would characterize her as a truffle pig when it comes to digging out strange and surprising and also very amusing material from the depths of the historical archive, always to illustrate what she calls the twists and turns of history. She's also very good at doing magical things with different formats of communication and publication. She does write very serious, very thick books, but she knows the tricks of turning these thick books into very accessible, smaller books, and also to write simply fabulous essays, which you will find in The New Yorker, where she is a regular contributor. What we should also mention here, because Luis and I are a fan of that in particular, is her wonderful podcast titled The Last Archive, which is done a little bit in the style of the fantastic 1930s radio shows, and we can highly recommend that you also pick up on that. So, Jill, as I said, you've earned your reputation as one of the most prolific mediators of American history through that talent to dig out strange stories and forgotten voices, more importantly, and to weave them into very original explanations of how America became what it is today. Now, do you remember when you became truly, really worried about the state of American democracy?
Well, first of all, thanks for the lovely introduction, and it's great to see you, and thanks to everyone for joining. I found professionally that as soon as I became a historian, I received the almost inevitable query from journalists about the relationship of this moment in American political history to past moments in American history as if we all should have a barometer, that historians have a kind of secret tool that we like whip out of our back pocket and say, oh, it's not as bad as it was in 1874, or, oh no, this is better than it was in 1922. That seemed to be as if that were the task of the historian, right? To kind of tell us how bad it is relative to how bad things have been in the past. And so a lot of my work as a historian has been sort of rejecting that notion. I mean, we live in the moment in which we live, and what matters is what we can do to make things better for people around us and for our communities. So something about the question always drove me a little crazy, and I would always try to dodge it. And I'm not trying to dodge your question. I'm actually just saying that I think I became kind of fascinated to know when Americans started asking that question of historians. This is not the question you always ask. It's not the role of an intellectual, right, to kind of be whether professional optimist or pessimist or sort of weather forecaster. And I think that it really is the consequence of Vietnam. Because in the early 1970s, after the revelations about Vietnam, they came out through the publication of the Pentagon Papers, a series of secret memos and documents. And then with the near impeachment of Richard Nixon, at that point, I think a lot of Americans felt like we were entering a new era. And so everything since then had to kind of be measured against that. That's when that kind of fascination with what is going to happen to this country that we thought was one thing, but turns out to be another thing. Not that everybody thought it was the one thing. So I got kind of fascinated by that question, but it took a very dramatic turn with Trump's election, obviously in 2016, where I think that actually the media's ability to understand Trump was impeded by this now, 40-year-long habit of just asking historians, is this as bad as Vietnam? Is this person as bad as Richard Nixon? As if that's all that we can learn from intellectuals, is the answer to those two questions. And so people kept trying to kind of figure out who Trump was like. Was he like George Wallace? Was he like Huey Long? Was he just like Nixon, or maybe was he worse than Nixon? And there seemed to be this kind of real effort to just understand Trump by way of analogy. And that's when, to me, it seemed as though the United States, in fact, did go on a very different path in electing Trump. And Trump is, in fact, unprecedented. And much that's happened in the United States since Trump's election in 2016, has really never happened before. And I think we're not particularly good at gaining our bearings. So, yeah, I do actually think the country took a turn in 2016. And we sadly lack a lot of the analytical skills that we might have if we had a richer understanding of how change happens.
Okay, thanks. Have you always been interested in the role technology plays for the American society?
Yes, I mean, since graduate school, when I was in graduate school, one of the more exciting intellectual disciplines emerging within the field of history was the field that's known as the history of the book, which really has its great strength in early modern European historiography, where scholars are really interested in understanding the consequences for political arrangements of the emergence of the printing press, the consequences for religious belief of the emergence of the printing press. It's a whole incredibly rich and exciting discipline. I was fascinated by that field, which hadn't really, although there was great scholarship on Europe, was sort of understandably. What did the emergence of printing, with the Gutenberg press do to all of Europe over the next 6 centuries? It was like a big question that European historians had been asking for a long time. But Americans had only really recently begun to ask that question. And the people who were studying that, like what does a printing press do, were sort of different from the people who were doing media studies, which they might be interested in. I was in graduate school before the internet. So it was more like, what effect does cable television have? What effect did the remote control have? This kind of pop culture-y sort of studies. So yeah, I've always found that to be a really interesting field. But when I was in graduate school, the United States, the Persian Gulf War began. And I had a lot of friends who were fighting in that war, who were in the Air Force. And I watched the war on television. And I didn't have the experience in watching Vietnam on TV. I wasn't old enough to do that. I wasn't born until 1966. But watching the Persian Gulf War on cable television news made me think a lot about how mediated a democracy is with new forms of public expression. And so my first book was about the relationship between war and the justification of war. It was about the 17th century, so it was about printing and letter writing. But I've always been interested in how technologies of communication reshape political arrangements.
Yeah. Both wars and television do play a role again in your most recent book. And in that book, which is titled If Then, you criticize the arrogance of Silicon Valley leaders who ignore the past to shape their visions of the future. You also claim that many of these men are driven by, and I quote from your book, creepy, bankrupt, exhausted, and discredited Cold War values. To prove this, you tell the story of a very strange and almost forgotten company that was said to have helped J.F. Kennedy into office in 1960. Now, how did you come across this early episode of what we call our present digital revolution?
Yeah, I guess I've been fascinated for a long time by how what the sort of most visible Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are peddling comes from 1950s science fiction or 1920s science fiction, honestly. So if you think about Elon Musk and his mission to Mars, or Jeff Bezos and his lunar station, these are guys who grew up reading the very mainstream science fiction of the 1950s, Isaac Asimov, say. And we don't, not to discredit Asimov, but Asimov's vision of science fiction and the science fiction from the 1920s, most of it is a kind of regurgitation of colonialism. And some of it, like say the science fiction of H.G. Wells, is a critique of colonialism. But for Bezos and Musk, they sort of absorb this kind of unreconstructed colonialist vision of what humanity's role is in the rest of the universe. And just like, but wait, we have been through a century of decolonialism, post-colonialism. Like everything about that vision has been critiqued deeply and been the subject of wars all over the world. And now it's being repackaged to us and sold to us as a consumer product. I somehow in a deep way don't even understand how that could be. So, and it partly relies on really just the abdication of the study of the past. It's a kind of a tenet of Silicon Valley innovation that you should never study the past, because if you were to study the past, it might impede on your ability to be truly imaginative about the future. But it turns out that if you fail to study the past, you can never really be imaginative about the future, because you just keep recycling things from the past. So much of Muskism and Bezosism is really recycled. And recycled bad ideas, recycled discredited ideas. So I was really interested in that. I've been, worrying about that for a long time. And then I happened to come across, I was working on an article for The New Yorker, and I went over to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is a short bike ride from my house. And I was looking at the papers of a political scientist whose name was Poole. And he had founded a company called the Simulmatics Corporation in 1959. He was its research director. And I found in the archives in his papers the original stock offering. Company went public in 1961. All of its brochures and manifestos, the punch card, coding cards. So the Simulmatics Corporation billed itself and went public on the stock market as a company that could use computer technology to predict human behavior. And in 1959, there were hardly any computers. There was one at MIT. The Census Bureau had one. There were like 4 in the country. There was one in San Diego. So to be using, IBM had a couple, but to be using a computer to predict human behavior in 1959 was so much earlier than I thought. The company lasted until 1970 when it went bankrupt, but I just sort of fell into these boxes and boxes and boxes of uncatalogued papers that chronicled its history, because what Simulmatics aimed to do starting in 1959 is really, what Facebook does. It's what most companies do behind the scenes, which is gather enough information about people in order to predict their behavior, in order to send them a message that would direct your behavior to a particular outcome, whether it's casting a vote or switching the brand of dog food that you buy, or changing your opinion about a community referendum. That fundamental work of using predictive analytics to influence consumer choices and democratic choices really does date to the 1950s, and it is specifically a Cold War project because Poole was a defense intellectual. He worked for the Pentagon, and so did many other people who worked for the Simulmatics Corporation. They were engaged in the massive project in the 1950s of behavioral science, using predictive modeling, certainly when aided by computers when that became available, to anticipate communist insurrection, communist insurgency. So one of the things that one of Poole's early projects when he worked for the Department of Defense was reading foreign language newspapers and transcripts of Soviet television broadcasts to search for key terms. This was called content analysis. It was brand new at the time. To search for key terms that might suggest, it's sort of like how the Defense Department reads chatter today, or our Department of Homeland Security reads internet chatter, looking for patterns that suggest terrorist activity, right? So that's what the Defense Department was doing in the 1950s. And they were doing it through counting the usage of certain kinds of words in certain forums. That kind of pattern detection work, all that, the voting prediction studies, those are basically, in short, so in 1947, Congress passes the National Security Act, which devotes a huge portion of the American economy to the Cold War, to the project of national security, this term, which is kind of new at the time. And a huge portion of that is funding that will go toward making the social sciences predictive sciences. So economics considers itself a predictive science, but most at the time, social sciences did not. But political scientists suddenly are told, if you could come up with a way to predict people's political behavior, you can get a lot of money from the military. You get a lot of money from anybody, from all kinds of different foundations and organizations, because we are engaged in this Manichaean war against communism the world over, and we need to be able to predict people's behavior so that we can avert the spread of communism in Africa and Asia in particular. And so political scientists say, well, how are we going to predict behavior? We don't even have a model for human behavior. And they think, well, we could maybe do this mathematically. We'll do a mathematical model. And to do a mathematical model, you need a lot of data. And the data that is available about people's behavior is voting behavior, because there's voting returns, and then there's public opinion surveys, and there's census data. So Poole and the other people who found Simulmatics build this giant program that they call the People Machine, which has enough voting data in it that they claim that they can predict the result of an election. Not only that, but they can predict how a new political message sent to people in the electorate will change the result of an election. And so they convince the Democratic National Committee that their machine works. They get hired by the Democratic National Committee, and then when John F. Kennedy becomes the Democratic nominee in 1960, running against Nixon, they're hired by the Kennedy campaign to do this work. That is to do these if-then sort of loops in their code, right? To say, if Kennedy were to talk in a more straightforward fashion about being a Catholic, then he would lose the Protestant vote, then he would gain the Jewish vote. Like, what is going to happen? Like, they would just run these endless simulations. So that's why the company is called the Simulmatics Corporation. It automates simulation.
Is that the, Jill, is that the beginning of what we call today targeted advertisement?
Yes, I mean, there had been some of that work done for television that was just a little bit earlier. So in 1952, the Eisenhower campaign hires an advertising agency that runs very targeted ads to get Eisenhower elected. And they do that even more successfully in 1956. And so this is, in fact, why the Democrats turn to a computer, because they say, oh, well, Eisenhower's figured out how to use television to send targeted messages to certain precincts where they have, they know he needs to win this district in Illinois in order to carry the state. So they do a big television buy in that district, and they send a particular message that their research says the people in that district would really like, and then they'll vote for Eisenhower. The Democrats say, we can't beat Eisenhower on television. The Republican Party is a party of big business. They have huge amounts of money for television advertising. They can just do that. We're never going to compete there. But we have the technocrats. We have all the Ivy League professors and the MIT professors and the Caltech professors and the Stanford professors who all want to help us with our campaign. They can figure out how to defeat television with the computer. Sort of weirdly, like that's kind of actually the calculation. Like, oh, we have like these brainiacs. They're called brainiacs then. That's like a new term. We have these brainiacs. They'll figure out how to do computer-targeted advertising or computer-targeted message adjustment. So yeah, that is where it comes from.
Jill, can you just tell us a little bit more about the role of African-American voters at that time, back in 1960? Because it was a big issue, especially for the Kennedy campaign.
Yeah, so black men who were enfranchised in 1870 generally could not vote in the South until the Voting Rights Act, which isn't passed until 1965 because their votes were suppressed. So but where they could vote in the North, where black male and female voters could vote in the North, they tended to vote Republican, because the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln, who ended slavery. FDR in the 1930s had successfully pulled a number of African-American voters into the New Deal coalition, but then the Democratic Party had not delivered on civil rights, and Eisenhower was strong on civil rights. And so a lot of black voters had returned to the Republican Party with Eisenhower in 1952 and 1956. And Democrats still didn't have a strong position on civil rights. Democratic Party was largely the party of white Southern conservatives. And they also had nominated twice in 52 and 56 Adlai Stevenson, who'd been governor of Illinois, who did not have a strong record on civil rights. So the guys who founded Simulmatics wanted to convince the Democratic Party to take black voters seriously, but they knew that one reason the Democratic Party didn't take black voters seriously is that there was no public opinion polling measurement of black voters. So most public opinion polling at the time was done by a guy named George Gallup, who had a nationally syndicated newspaper column called America Speaks, and he reported the results of his public opinion surveys every week, and it was much followed. But because blacks couldn't vote in the South, because of vigilante terrorism, essentially, and because his Southern newspapers that bought the column would object if he polled black voters in the North, he never polled black voters. He just decided to discount the entire African-American electorate. So there really was very, very little knowledge about how blacks would vote, like in public. We have voting returns. So the Simulmatics guys, their first project was to do a simulation of black voters in northern states in order to convince the Democratic Party, as their research did suggest, that if the Democratic Party took a stronger position on civil rights, then black voters would vote for the Democratic candidate, who would then be able to win enough northern states to defeat Eisenhower, or who then was going to be clear would be Nixon, his successor. So, and the Kennedy campaign Kennedy himself had been extremely weak on civil rights as well. And the advice that the Simulmatics Corporation gave in a series of reports to the Kennedy campaign was, you need to have a much stronger position on civil rights. And they also told the Democratic National Committee to have a very strong civil rights plank in its platform in 1960. And both of those things happened, and Kennedy did win in that way. So it's impossible to know. Like, I can't say with any authority, if Simulmatics hadn't presented that report, Kennedy wouldn't have taken that strong position. And then if Kennedy hadn't taken that strong position, he wouldn't have won. But I still think it pretty much looks that way.
Okay. You suggest in your book that we can draw a pretty straight line between Simulmatics and that shady British company called Cambridge Analytica, which was again said to have helped Donald Trump into office in 2016. Yeah,
although I think you can also draw a line, and maybe I didn't emphasize this in the book, to the social media campaigns of Barack Obama in 2008, who also used that social media technology in really innovative ways and did a lot of election prediction and modeling that was really pivotal to that victory. We think of the Cambridge Analytica model as it's associated with Brexit and with Trump's victory, and part of the people who are going to be concerned about that are going to be concerned more about that than about Obama's victory. But in fairness, it was in fact that the left wasn't especially good at using these tools. Not that they didn't use them. So it's maybe important to think about that as a distinction. But I do think they are the direct descendants of this company. And one of the things that was quite striking to me in doing the research is how much outrage there was that the Kennedy campaign had done this, that we just don't even have that outrage anymore. We expect that data analytics companies are gathering information about us and using it to predict our behavior and influence our behavior, and including influence our votes. And then we go about and brush our teeth and go read a novel and go to bed. It's like as if that's just the way the world has to be. In 1959, when Simulmatics was first circulating its proposal to do what it wanted to do, a lot of people said, you can't do this. This is just morally inexcusable. Like if it's a democracy, people have to actually base their votes on information that they gather and make a good decision and not be turned into pieces of data in a machine that can be manipulated. And when Kennedy won and the Simulmatics Corporation kind of ran a publicity blitz taking credit for his victory, the Kennedy campaign denied ever even hearing of the company because they knew what a bad situation it would put them in. Newspapers all over the country said Kennedy was elected by a computer. We've all become robots. We've all become automated. Now we're obsolete. This is what happens with automation. Pretty soon there won't be voters anymore. There was a lot of anxiety about that. There's a great story by Isaac Asimov, I think it's from 1955, in which one person chooses the president every year because the person is selected by a computer as the most representative American. And in a way, that's sort of what the Simulmatics project meant to do, right? To just kind of numerically quantify what it would be to be the electorate. Like, why bother to vote if a computer can figure it all out?
But Jill, I wonder, because you're saying there's not a huge outcry about big data being used by these huge private companies such as Facebook and so on. But when I look at the discourse in America right now, from Germany, it seems like the narrative is shifting and lawmakers are really cracking down on these companies. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I think that, well, I first of all say, why now? Like, it's inexplicable to me that this didn't happen in 2016 or 2015. Really, frankly, quite shocking. Like, if you think about the other gross ethical missteps of other forms of scientific inquiry, they all were followed by a reckoning. You know, you use napalm in Vietnam, there's going to be a lot of chemical companies that are going to close down. There are going to be riots in the streets. And then there are going to be new rules around chemical warfare that are part of international treaties. Like, you think about Nuremberg and the emergence of bioethics. You think about the atom bomb and the incredible shuddering of physicists and new regulations around nuclear research. I admit, you know, what Facebook did in 2015 and 2016 or Cambridge Analytica, it doesn't compare to, I'm not comparing that to Hiroshima and Nagasaki or Nuremberg, but it is actually like a crazy ethical reckoning moment that just went right by. You know, Mark Zuckerberg said, oh, we had nothing to do with this. And people, well, what do you mean? How does he get away with saying that? Like, that's around the time I was working on this project, right? Like, I was like, I don't understand. Why does he get a pass? Is it just because of how, you know, people like to be able to have posts from their second cousin or someone they knew in high school? I've never understood the appeal of social media, so I don't get it in some deep way. So you're right. I totally take your point. There is a lot of alarm now. I'm not sure that it is particularly focused. And if anything, I think it maybe is focused only on Facebook, which kind of was dying anyway. I mean, I don't know. You know, the younger users are not using Facebook. Like Facebook is sort of like the tobacco company when it just needs to keep coming up with new products. Like now, instead of e-cigarettes, they have Instagram or what, like they have to keep creating products that will attract younger and younger users and addict them to the service. But the bigger, you know, the bigger decisions, like it's not as though they're here anyway, is on a table a scheme whereby every piece of data that is taken from you, you get paid for. You know, there are people that have these kind of micro payment schemes, which is just to make it very costly for companies to take your data. They have to pay you for it. That would be a kind of de facto way of regulating an industry that's out of control. There's nothing like that actually on the table. There's more a lot of members of Congress wanting to be seen on television asking a hard question. You know, like that's sort of all that's going on as far as I can tell.
So is it, to just pick up on that, is it merely a question of legal regulation or also of building an ethos when we deal with such products and technologies? Or wouldn't we also have to change business models, tax systems, and perhaps even more aspects of that new system of platform capitalism?
Yeah, I think there is a real need for a very different business model. And I don't see, in the US, our federal government is so wholly dysfunctional that I don't see a way forward there. I can imagine it's boycott that gets you there. I'm trying to understand what regulatory agency could even, you know, I would have thought the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, would have been much more involved looking at this long ago than they have been. And we have, because of our regime of free speech, there's very little appetite for doing anything that involves asking Facebook to regulate its content. So, I mean, if there's several problems, there's the content issue, the misinformation, the automation of outrage, the radicalizing and the polarizing nature of the algorithm. But then there's the issue of kind of the custodial problems of younger people and what it is doing to them. And then there's the financial issue, the kind of payments and business model issue. I think they're really distinct issues. But the broader ethos question is one that is really tricky. One of my favorite suggestions that I ever heard is very low tech, partly why I like it, but Jonathan Zittrain, my colleague here at Harvard, he's at the law school and at the Berkman Center for the Internet and Society, was telling once at a talk how he thought when Facebook is making a decision about whether to post a political advertisement, that right now that goes through some internal, I don't know, somebody who just basically says, yes, give me the money, as far as I can tell. But he had this idea that should go to high school civics classes in like 4 different states, in like 2 red states and 2 blue states, and we'll have 48 hours to research the ad and decide whether it should be put up or whether it contained misinformation and shouldn't be allowed. And that they would then have to meet together in a quorum meeting of all the high school kids and have a vote, and that Facebook would have to take their decision as a binding one, which I liked because it's such a twofer. Like on the one hand, Facebook figures out whether or not to put up a political ad, but more, it actually asks young people to learn the skills of deciding how to tell whether a political message is warranted, whether you think it's true, whether it's an unfair characterization of the problem. So I kind of honestly like these solutions like that, which don't, you know, they're not wholesale solutions, but that actually go away toward building cognitive tools and in particular social and community tools for addressing the decay of intellectual discrimination and the ability to build coalitions, political coalitions that are some of the consequences of social media.
Are you in some way saying that we also need to, perhaps not just in America, to reinvent the good old civic education classes in the schools and perhaps integrate something like media education?
Yeah, there have been many efforts to reintroduce civics education. There are media literacy classes that are offered in the U.S. I think there is actually quite a lot of that goes on already and is sort of unrecognized and uncelebrated. And I don't think the federal government is the one to be, suggesting what that should look like. I wouldn't want that. I don't think those are political decisions, but I guess I think more there are community-based ways to implement some of those ideas in a classroom.
Jill, you seem to have such a grim outlook on social media and big data in democratic processes, but I wonder, are there positive sides to it as well? The use of big data brings, we have more evidence available. In a democracy, we're supposed to be informed. So is there anything that you can see that is positive about this development of more and more big data being used in democratic processes?
Well, I have no against evidence, right? Like, people collect and then aggregate data that tells us about the weather and the climate and the natural world and the movement of stars and traffic, and things that are in the physical and the natural world, I think are predictive because there are laws that they follow, right? There are laws of motion and laws of gravity. So that and then there's some sort of systems laws in biological systems, right? So that's all great. Students should be learning sophisticated ways to do the best work with that kind of evidence. I don't think that they should. My two beefs with it are, one, we live in a culture in which that somehow is the only kind of evidence that matters. Like, if you don't have a data-driven product, right? Like, you hear that on the radio all the time. Like, it's just meaningless, right? Like, what I have like an intuition-driven product. Like, it has such cultural cachet right now that it discredits all other ways of knowing. Like, a poem is a way of knowing. A bar of music is a piece of evidence. Like, it's so. Data wants to conquer the world. Like, no other way of knowing something matters except for if you have. It's just a very ultimately kind of shoddy and arrogant way to think about how one knows things. Obviously, you want to know in any possible way you can know about something, right? You want to get a new dog. You want to find out, about any problems that dog might have by reading veterinary science about that breed or something, and some of that's going to come from very data-heavy studies. You also want to talk to your neighbors and see if a dog that barks a lot is going to be a problem for them. You want to meet the puppy. Like, there's just 1,000 ways you'd want to know about that dog. It wouldn't all be data-driven, and we accept that in ordinary life. Like, why, just as a kind of business marketing strategy, do we tolerate it as if all in the world of consumer goods or larger scale ways of knowing in the world? So that's one thing, just kind of the arrogance of it, and the diminution of humanistic knowledge in particular in the world of the arts. But the second thing is, I don't actually think that data should be used to predict outcomes of human behavior where they are chiefly social outcomes. So I don't actually think human behavior is as predictable as many elements of the natural world. And when you try to predict human behavior using the data that we have, the chance that you're going to replicate forms of asymmetry and inequality is very, very high. So, for instance, in the U.S., there has been a lot of pickup in using sentencing algorithms for criminals who are convicted of for people who are convicted of crimes. To decide how long someone should be in prison, you put the information about them into a sentencing algorithm, and it says, oh, you shall be in prison for 4 years and 7 months without probation. Oh, and you should do community service, and then for 3 months, and then you're done. Yes, information in that algorithm is about the crime, but it's also demographic information. It's about the neighborhood that you live in and the school that you went to. And any research into that kind of use of predictive algorithms for social outcomes has revealed uniformly that they just perpetuate existing forms of inequality, right? So, or children who are assessed in kindergarten and placed in certain routes based on, there are now algorithms that are, placing kids in different schoolrooms. I just don't think that should be done. I think that I just think that's unethical. I don't think it's scientific. I think, it doesn't, I just have not seen the evidence that it's effective. I think what it is doing is it's replicating existing problems instead of addressing them.
Is the not very American, but perhaps international obsession with data-driven forms of knowledge that rely very much on counting, on measuring, on pattern recognition, is it also perhaps a sign of the fact that we don't trust in hermeneutics anymore, that we have lost our capability to contextualize and to understand things in different ways, independent of the new powerful machines?
I mean, when you think about it historically, I make this argument that the elemental unit of knowledge has changed from the fact, which is an observed event, right? A fact is something like from the French fait, like it's something, it's an act that happened that you saw. To the number, which is, a quantification of a set of observed facts that can be communicated across a great distance, to data. And I think the turn from the fact to number is not that we still have facts and numbers, but data is now reigning supreme. The turn to using numbers, which really was a kind of German term with the rise of statistics, was about the authority of the state in the end of the 19th century. So that the state had information about its citizens and could exercise new kinds of authority over them at the time that the nation state was really just grabbing power. But it emerged too from the efficiency of scientists sharing research about evidence across distances where you couldn't observe one another's experiments. But you could report them, and with very fine level of detail numerically and statistically about their significance, and other people could replicate them. And it was responsible for an extraordinary explosion in scientific knowledge. And you could say the same has been true with the turn to data, which is sort of like more numbers than a person can work with, right? Like you need computational power to work with data that you don't necessarily need to do the kind of statistics that were done when statistics was being born. So I guess it's a continuation of that same work, but in a way, what becomes complicated about data is its mystification. So in the realm of the fact, right, the realm of the fact comes from trial by jury, where in the Anglo-American tradition, we believe that 12 random people put in a room and present with a bunch of evidence by people that have different arguments about that evidence can decide a verdict, which, can decide the truth. And that is, the humanistic contextual knowledge, that we believe in it's a very incredibly optimistic vision of the human capacity for thinking and discriminating about evidence. So if we believe that 12 people in a room can look at a body of evidence and two competing interpretations of it and decide what's true, that's what democracy is based on in some deep way, right? We believe that 4 million people in a polity can read the newspaper and decide which is the best direction for the country to take, and we will abide by the truth of their decision, which is the outcome of the election, and then we have a chance to do it all over again. It's not to say that that's perfect, but that is kind of how most of the architecture of a Republican form of government is built. The data version is you put everything into a machine and the machine tells you, and so it is, and this is what all the anxiety in the 50s and 60s was about. Where's the human capacity for reason there? The people that built the machine have done some really prodigious thinking and building, but the people who just become bits of information in the machine, it's very hard to think about that as democracy. And so then where does the desire to express yourself politically go? I don't know, maybe it goes into populism and insurrection.
There's a lot of, a lot of people are saying we live in a post-truth world, and you've hinted at the insurrection, the January 6th insurrection. Do we live in a post-truth world, or do we have a crisis of truth, in your opinion?
This is the subject of the whole of my podcast, is this question of, how did we sort of get here? I think it is less new than it is made to seem. But there have been struggles over how a mass society can know anything since there has been a mass society, and there are other versions of struggles over truth, which we mainly associate with religious wars, right? But in the modern era, I think it really is largely a problem that dates to the age of the radio in the 1920s. That is to say, in a mass democratic society, can you trust the people to make good decisions when technologies of communication can be bought by moneyed interests who can send out particular messages that will overwhelm the messages that their political opponents might send out? And this the sort of influence of money in politics, given those technological changes, is something that I can only speak to the U.S., but every few years we try to come up with another. It's just trying to keep up with the many different ways that money can interfere with politics. We don't have particularly good ways, but it's more money than it is technology. Technology makes it easier, and I think the problem now is technology has made it so easy that it's very difficult to undo. So one of the ways I think, years and years ago, that people talked about Facebook was that it was an automated polarizing machine, that what it was doing was just driving people to political extremes. Same thing's true with YouTube or Twitter. Driving people to political extremes and then making it very difficult for them to leave the political extremity, because the machine is automated. So unless you go in and change the machine itself, it's hard to say to people, oh, well, you just shouldn't think that your political opponents are Satanists, when they do, and everything that they read online tells them that their political opponents are Satanists, and they no longer have other sources of information. They don't have a local newspaper or whatever it is that they used to use. This is, gets you back to the Rage Against the Machine of the 1960s, which was a very similar phenomenon.
As you just mentioned your podcast, you seem to be such a successful science communicator that people could assume that you are very interested in finding out which target groups. And here we again enter the realm of behavioral science and counting the audiences. Who actually out there is listening to the podcast? So would you be at all interested in that, in any evidence to demonstrate that you reach out to so many different types of listeners? Or do you get letters? I know that you had lots of responses to earlier books, actually letters written by readers. How about the podcast? Are you curious to learn who's actually listening?
Well, the podcast is produced by a podcast company, and they have all that information and pay a lot of attention to it. So
I bet.
As they must, that's their job. In the same way that I don't track the sales of my books. I don't read what people say about my New Yorker articles. I don't go Google search for responses to my New Yorker articles. I get letters, and I get a lot of mail, actually, and I get a lot of email, and I read all of that, and I do my best to respond to it. But no, I figure if no one's listening, then I won't be asked to do it anymore. So at some level, it's kind of all I really need to, and that surely that will have, you don't always have an audience. But the reason that I don't, it's not like I'm contemptuous of it, but by far, I'm really trying to reach an audience, really hard. I really want people to listen, or I want people to read. I'm not there's plenty of work I do that's just for other scholars, but if I'm doing it for a different audience, I want to reach that audience. And I'm really grateful for those listeners and those readers. But the reason that I don't do what many other people in my position would do, which would be on social media, pushing stuff out, following the response, charting it, trying to direct the response, engaging with it, is that I actually think it's quite difficult to have fresh ideas in a world of such constant chatter. And I think if you are always calibrating your work to respond to whatever, the Twitter vibe of the moment, then you're maybe not doing something as independent-minded as you think. Like, you just unconsciously, you would be sort of tweaking your tone or your argument. And if I were running a TV series and I needed to have a certain number of people every month watching or whatever, and I had to tweak to respond, but that's not what I'm doing. I am actually a scholar. So there are things that I think the evidence tells me that I want to share with the public, but if the public doesn't want to hear it, I'm not going to revise the evidence. So what the two-wayness of it is a little bit confusing to me. I'm not sure what that would look like.
We have a question from one of our viewers. Fabian Klein-Arndt asked, Dear Jill Lepore, who should be responsible to create algorithms that function for the common good, and what is the role of civil society actors and organizations in such revolutionary times?
That's a really interesting question. I wonder if there's maybe a model from public interest law, which started really in the 1960s when things that corporations were doing were causing a lot of damage. And law schools started operating legal clinics to provide free services to call corporations to account. So we associate that with Ralph Nader, unsafe at any speed, in his indictment of the automobile industry, that led to, seat belts and what are those cushions called?
Airbags. Yeah.
Airbags. All the safety measures, and automobiles really come from the sort of citizen initiative, public interest lawyer-led efforts to get corporations to do the right thing, which is to say, there was a lot of anti-government feeling at the time, and that the government, we needed, that waiting for the government to adopt new regulations wouldn't be successful, would be less successful now. Again, we cannot pass a law. We can't, I hate to say this in another country, foreign enemies of the United States, I'm sorry to admit, we don't appear to be able to pass a law. But I think that combination of citizen initiative and public interest laws may be one model for thinking about a new ethics of public interest algorithm writing. There are lots of initiatives in that regard. There's a lot of organizations that are really fighting for very careful scrutiny with consequences of racial justice around algorithms. There is a new center here, I believe, at the University of Massachusetts on public interest technological development. So I think there's a lot of movement in that direction. But it's the kind of thing where what you would ordinarily expect to bring about change is the political legislative process. But among the consequences of this dysfunction is the legislative process isn't working. So it's very difficult to imagine changing this legislatively. So that's why I'm just what are the non-legislative ways to do things? Do a lot of work with young people, do public interest work, do citizens groups. I don't think it's enough, but it might be all that can, in the US, it might be all that can happen in the short term.
How do you see the situation in European countries or in other parts of the world? Do you see any alternative models? Do you see societies who are moving into exactly that direction? Do you see something like a perhaps global decline of democratic culture?
You know, there are metrics that purport to measure the health of democracies around the world. The Freedom House measures the democracy index that The Economist puts out. So, and I haven't looked at those lately. The last time I looked at those, you know, there was a lot of concern that a lot of measures of the health of democracies were on the decline. I would say globally, a thing that I tend to see in a kind of deep way as on the decline in a worrying way that is related to voters becoming data is the declining belief in or even really understanding of representation. That is to say, most democracies are founded on the idea that you elect people to represent the interests of your community, including your interests. But if you are in a county and you're going to elect one representative from that county to serve in the legislature, the idea there is the person is not a delegate. I didn't elect, Harriet to go do my bidding and express my views and only my views in Congress. I elected Harriet because she seemed like a person of judgment and intelligence and knowledge and integrity to make good decisions on the floor of the legislature as they would affect the whole of the country, and maybe in particular my county, and maybe even me. But that I understand in electing Harriet as a representative of my county, that I might disagree a lot of the times with the things that she thinks are right, because maybe she's actually been to 5 briefings and I don't really know anything. I just looked at the newspaper once and I don't even know what my opinion is based on. That's how representation works. And I don't think that most people believe in representation anymore, because we swim in a water in which we're not represented, but we always represent ourselves. Well, what do you think of in a case in the U.S. that I often think about? Our constitutional arrangements require that the president nominate a Supreme Court justice, and then the Senate vote on whether to appoint that nominee. Popular opinion has nothing to do with it. The people have no role in the selection of Supreme Court justice. None. Never have. It's not in the Constitution. Our Supreme Court is so politicized now that people run for president, and Donald Trump did this as well, and Biden did this, on the promise that they will nominate the Supreme Court justice that would suit your interests, your personal interests. And that, which is its own corruption of the constitutional order, isn't enough. Like, when there's a nominee, people go on Twitter and express their individual views about who should be the next justice. That's where there's sort of the whole fracas around Brett Kavanaugh and then the Christine Blasey Ford. Like, everybody in the country had an opinion about whether Brett Kavanaugh should be on the Supreme Court, as if this was a popular referendum, as if how we choose. I think at some level, most Americans believed in their heart of hearts that we choose Supreme Court justices based on a popular referendum. So everybody should have a view. You should express your own view. And if you don't get your view, you get a right to be really, really angry. It has nothing to do with how we select Supreme Court justices. Now, you might say, as I would say, the Supreme Court has far too much power. We really need to reform the Supreme Court. I don't even really like the way that they're chosen and nominated and approved. But nevertheless, that is actually how they, I don't get to say, do I think Brett Kavanaugh should, I can say I can have an opinion about it. But in other words, the basic workaround, there is a set of rules, and then there are rules about the rules. And you cede when you consent to be governed, you cede some political authority to the idea that other people will represent the interests of your community. And that takes a certain amount of humility, for one thing, which is in pretty short supply. Right? So I worry about that in a deep way, that some of the populist insurgency and left-wing insurgency as well, but it's both a left and a right phenomenon, is deeply anti-representation. So anti-democratic is a way to think about that, but it's deeply hostile to the idea of representation.
And there's one of our viewers picking up on that. David Alders asked, "Dear Jill, representation seems to be linked to trust. What has happened to trust? This also seems to be the case for knowledge, trust in experts, etc. How has social media contributed to eroding trust?"
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of contributors to that. For the podcast, I interviewed this wonderful historian of science who said he thought the whole crisis of truth was really misunderstood, and then it was a misnomer, that really what much of the world, and not all of it by any means, but is going through is a crisis of social knowledge, which is really a crisis of trust, that you have to belong to a society of some kind in order to place your trust in institutions or individuals or bodies of evidence or whatever it is. And there's been such a decay. It's very fashionable in the U.S. to talk about the fraying of the social fabric. I've just written a long essay about this question of society. But so I think that the notion of social knowledge is a really important one. And Stephen Chapin, who's the historian I was interviewing, his work is actually about the 17th century, where he was talking about the Royal Society in London and how being elected to the Royal Society, it was very hard to be elected to the Royal Society, but if you were, then people trusted your research, because it was just a kind of shorthand way it was like peer review in academic discourse or something, right? Like, we can't just, I can't just say, well, I did these experiments on pigeons and I bred pigeons for 12 generations and I have discovered that you get spotted eggs if you do it. Like, I could say that, but you'd be like, why should we trust you, Jill? But if I had, through a very elaborate vetting process, become elected to the Royal Society, and then I published my pigeon experiment, well, then other people still have to replicate it for it to be taken as, as a meaningful result. But they're going to bother to replicate it because I'm a member of the Royal Society. And so his sort of argument is like, that's like a really good example of social knowledge. Like, literally, it's a society. It's a society, and it's exclusive, and probably in ways that we know have terribly malign consequences, right? Because a lot of the people in the Royal Society are, demographically similar to one another, and they're ideas that they held that came from their social position and that were wrong. So it's a problem to be in a society that's closed like that, and that's the only way things can be known. But it did actually really advance a lot of knowledge. And so these kind of institutions that are, societies of professional journalists, say, that where there are rules and standards, where you could say, well, I subscribe to the New York Times because I know that I know that they have an editor and an editorial board that has, ethics, and that they fact check their pieces. Those social structures in some realms still exist, and in some realms they just don't exist at all anymore. And it's, they've often been dismantled by people who purposefully wanted to dismantle them because of the biases that they were perpetuating. And that came, on the whole, from both the left and from the right, right? So conservatives decided to attack major newspapers and major television news networks on the ground that they were essentially a liberal conspiracy against conservative ideas, which found no place in those venues. And people on the left similarly wanted to dismantle those news organizations on the ground that they were dismissive of views from the left. And they both got what they wanted, and now people have a very hard time knowing anything.
I find it quite convincing that you defend institutions as something which is absolutely necessary to retain trust in our social fabric. However, if I look at the book If Then, I was very interested to see that you draw a very critical picture of especially male-dominated, very exclusive networks and institutions. So we haven't really talked about your interest in gender politics and the many other inequities of not just the American system. If we look at the digitized cultures, especially of the Silicon Valley, isn't it also part of their problem that they didn't manage to clean up their misogynist corporate culture?
Yes. Yeah, I think that it's part of one of the things I was really fascinated by and spent a lot of time with in the book about the Simulmatics Corporation was that these men had these very 1950s marriages. They were white liberal, middle-class men. Many of them had university affiliations. Their families were very involved in the company because I don't know if people remember this era, but there was always like the company picnic. Like there were all these like bring your wife and children along events that companies had. And it's at that era where to be married and have children means you're more likely to climb the corporate ladder, which is still the case. Whereas for a woman to be married and have children, you're less likely to climb the corporate ladder. But I was fascinated by the domestic part of the company when what these male scientists were allegedly trying to do was understand and predict human behavior. And I read a lot of the correspondence of their wives, and their marriages were pretty uniformly terrible. And the thing that their wives always said was, my husband doesn't understand me or the children. And the women will be raising the children. Some of the women, one of them was a nursery school teacher. She was an expert on human behavior. And that to these behavioral scientists, the mystery was actually the behavior of women and children, or the behavior of people of color. So they wanted to understand the black voter, or then they had an office in Saigon, and they wanted to understand the Vietnamese. And they would produce these elaborate computer programs to predict the behavior of people who were not white men, because they just deeply could not understand anyone else. And everything that their wives and children did seemed to take them by surprise. And I just found that really fascinating, sort of sociologically. Like, it was the crisis of a kind of mid-century white masculinity in the United States to be baffled by what the hell was going on. Here are women starting to, white women, part of the second wave feminist movement. The long civil rights movement is just incredibly visible on the streets, on television, even for people who aren't involved in it. You're looking at communist insurgencies in countries all over Africa and Asia. There's this sort of bafflement of like, oh no, we are no longer entirely in control. We could come up with a computer to do this. And I just feel like that casts a long shadow, because I don't need to personalize it, but you look at some of these guys and when they talk about what they're doing, now they talk about, Zuckerberg or Musk or Bezos. Well, they're saving the human race. And it's like, but wait, that was imperialism. Do you know what I mean? Like, what? Did you not, were you not here? Like, did you not, what happened a century ago that you don't know about anymore? It just seems like, that's what I mean, it sort of seems so tired and recycled. It's like, oh no, we are back on top because now we have the machines too. So we can stay in control. And not that I have a lot of friends who work for tech companies and do great work. Like, I don't mean to seem like a Luddite. Like, it's not like I have my iPhone right here. Like, I'm not like a crazy person. I just, like, deep cultural level, the longing for an era when your very privileged position would go unchallenged seems to be manifest in the machine. I mean, a story I sometimes tell about this, I was in San Francisco, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago at a dinner. We gave a talk and then I was out to dinner, and someone who's an English professor was telling me that her, 5 row houses on her street got bought up by one tech startup guy who just made a bunch of money and was going to make this mega, the thing that happens in San Francisco with this incredible wealth. And she was talking to the guy on the street one day, the one day she ever saw him, that he wasn't up and in his limo and off to wherever. And she was saying, it's been a little tough in our neighborhood that you guys are coming in and buying 5 housing units that could, 100 people could live in those buildings all put together, and it's just you and your 2 dogs. Where's your sense of civil society, your social concepts of justice? Because this is pretty hard for those of us who live here and people who are homeless. And he said, oh, well, I have founded a new initiative, and I forget what it was called, but it was truly you couldn't make this up, which was a school to teach the homeless how to code. She's like, I think we can't talk. Like, I don't think you understand how I understand a problem or how you understand a solution, because they're not homeless because they don't know how to code. Like, and at some level, like, it's not like an evil person. Like, I would be hard pressed to contain myself in that conversation, but it's not like an evil person. It's a person, like, I recognize that, people having no place to live is a problem, but I don't recognize the larger system that I'm part of. It's that seems like the kind of thing a cinematics guy could have said. You know what I mean? Like, oh, there's racial protests over police brutality in Detroit. We have a machine that can predict the next race riot. And that they literally did that for the Kerner Commission. Well, is that a solution to racial injustice? Like, I just don't think about the world that way. And we live in a world now where the people with the most economic power think about the world in only that way, that they can engineer their way out of every social or political problem. That has been tried and it doesn't work. And if you were to study history, you would see that that's just really not likely to work now. But the people that don't think that way don't have a lot of economic power. So this is to get back to the question about being despairing. It's among my reasons for despair.
We have another question from a viewer. Mark Berman asks, has there in American history or in global history, if you will, been a period where trust among the people and between the people and the government was comparatively high? And if yes, what could we learn from that era? Maybe that first, and then there's a second one following.
Yeah, I think that I can't myself picture a chart that looks at that, but sometimes historians will say that the 40s, 50s, and 60s were a very distinctive period in American history because income inequality was extremely low and because political polarization was extremely low. And there's a scholar who at Princeton who has studied the relationship between these two things in that era, and he ascribes the low polarization and mostly the low polarization, that the low income inequality is mainly due to the New Deal, which is implemented in the 30s and lasts through the 60s. So that there's this era of relative income inequality, relative income equality. He says it's because it was the only period in American history where, this seems silly, when you come home from work at 6 o'clock, if you want to watch something on TV, the only thing that was really on was network broadcast news. So we have 4 networks that broadcast news at 6 o'clock from 6 basically to 8 o'clock every day, local news and then national news. And there was some variety in that news, but people generally trusted the news. And why that produced low polarization was those people who watched TV and didn't really want to watch the news, but the news was the only thing that was on and they were cooking dinner for their kids, they tended to vote, even though they didn't have strong political views, because they kept hearing, oh, it's election day next Tuesday or whatever. And so they moderated the electorate. But that with the introduction of cable television, which in the US comes in the mid-1970s, suddenly there are 200 stations on. So when you come home from work at 6 o'clock, you're starting to make dinner, you put on the TV, you have 200 choices. And most people who don't care about politics are going to watch, reruns of Gilligan's Island or, a rerun of the latest James Bond movie or something. And then those people stopped voting. That is to say that they were, it's not that they stopped trusting the news, they stopped following the news, and then they stopped voting. So there was a rise in polarization when those people fell out of the electorate. They're now back in the electorate, but they get their news from the Facebook news feed, which is just polarizing them. So that it's not so much that there was an era when people were kind of in a good-hearted, open-hearted way trusting television news or something. Yes, the television news then was probably better, but also just the way just weird window of time when the technologies of communication really restricted your choices, produced a lot of political serenity is the wrong thing to say. I mean, there was a lot of mayhem going on and this, incredible abuses of civil rights. And there's like a lot of other, domestic chaos in the U.S. in those years. But relative to now, those look really distinctive.
There's a follow-up question from Mark Berman, and you partially maybe answered it already, but he asked, what is your view as an historian on how trust is best nurtured in a society?
I don't know. I really don't know. I think I can see it decline, but I have a hard time imagining what measures promote it. I also think, in a just kind of bald way, that prosperity helps, right? People doing well, who don't feel that what little they have is about to be taken from them, are much more likely to trust major institutions than when that is not the case. I maybe have time for one more question, but I'm going to have to go to my next meeting.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
There are a couple, but should I take one, or do you want?
Yes, take one.
All right. Raphael Loss asks, in addition to tech libertarianism, tech authoritarianism of Chinese and Russian, all those are on the rise. What are the particular challenges presented by the latter? How do we confront both at the same time? And how can we come up with a better third way that doesn't dismiss the benefits of a more networked world? Wow, what a big question in the end.
It makes me think a little bit of, in the 1930s, the United States was charged with finding the third way, right? When, there was communism on the one hand, and then there was fascism on the other hand, but both involved essentially the state control of the economy as the only possible remedy for the extraordinary suffering of the financial crises of the beginning decades of the 20th century. And so the third way was to find a way basically between communism and laissez-faire capitalism, and that was the New Deal. And it had an analog in the broadcast medium, which was the fairness doctrine that came out of the Federal Communications Commission, which was a New Deal project. The Federal Communications Commission was founded in 1934 under Roosevelt, and so there was a third way in terms of economic reform, and there was a third way in terms of regulation of communication. So that's why I spend a lot of time thinking about those 1930s solutions, and I think that people who care about these issues spend a lot of time thinking about those 1930s solutions. The difference is, we don't have FDR.
That's a grim outlook, Jill.
No, it's not grim. You just gave us such a rich and splendid package containing lots of food for thought. Thank you so much for that, Jill. Let's hope that we meet again. We will meet again wherever it is possible. Thanks a lot, and all best to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Jill. Bye. And that's the end for us as well. There is a feedback button which is very important to us. So if you may just press that button right after the talk and give us some feedback.
Tun Sie das. Should I stay with German or English? I think I can switch back into German here. Vielen Dank für Ihr Interesse an diesem ziemlich reichhaltigen und nicht ganz unkomplizierten Abend. Schauen Sie sich die Bücher an, hören Sie sich den Podcast an. Bei Jill Lepore ist noch viel zu finden. Und wir sollen Sie hinweisen auf den schon bald folgenden Salon aus dieser Stiftung, nämlich am Mittwoch übermorgen um 17 Uhr mit dem deutschen Soziologen Armin Nassé über die Themen Teilhabe und Zusammenhalt. Schalten Sie sich wieder zu, haben Sie noch einen schönen Abend. Vielen Dank für Ihr Interesse. Auf bald.
Tschüss, Wiederschauen.
Jill Lepore, Julika Agrim, Louis Klamroth, thank you so much for this insightful and exciting debate. It also gave us in Stiftung Mercator a lot of suggestions and ideas for new cooperation and projects. All unseren Gästen einen herzlichen Dank für den Besuch des heutigen Mercator-Salons und auf bald.
Vor uns liegen große Herausforderungen. Wir werden auch in Zukunft optimistisch daran arbeiten. Wir sind der Stifterfamilie für das anhaltende Vertrauen und die Unterstützung dankbar. Wir danken auch allen, die unsere Arbeit möglich und wirkungsvoll machen. Unserem Beirat, unseren PartnerInnen und unseren KollegInnen in Essen, Berlin, Peking und Istanbul. Gemeinsam treten wir ein für Weltoffenheit, Solidarität und Chancengleichheit.